Hi, I'm attorney Glenn Wagstaff. I wanted to share some thoughts with you regarding succession planning and estate planning, specifically for farmers and ranchers. You know, a lot of times we think about estate planning as something that only the very ultra wealthy do. But the reality is that estate planning is important for everybody. The average American doesn't have any planning in place. And if you don't have a plan, a lot of times you're exposing yourself to the risks of the court system. Even while you're still alive, if you don't have documents like a power of attorney or a healthcare directive, in the case of an emergency, nobody has any automatic authority to make decisions on your behalf. And so one of the things that happens is that you end up in the court process having to get a guardianship or a conservatorship, and that's something that's so easy to avoid. So almost everybody, whether you're married, not married, whether you have children, don't have children, whether you have a lot of assets or don't have any assets, needs to have a financial power of attorney and a healthcare directive. And in the farming community, it's no exception. One of the things that we've noticed is that when people have these documents in place, it really makes things easier and more streamlined in the case of emergencies. And it's not just the powers of attorney that you need, but once you have children, then it's important to have a last will and testament, because that's where you get to name the person that's going to be responsible for your children if something should happen to you. And in particular, when you have minor children. Unfortunately, if you just have a will, your will is going to end up in a process called probate. And that could take a long time. It can be very expensive. It's a public process, and most people want to avoid that. So, you know, we hear horror stories of people who leave, their home or their farm or, their business behind, and all of a sudden everybody's fighting over everything. That happens when there's not an effective plan and when everything ends up in the court system. So if you only have a will, you're basically asking for that sort of situation to happen, because everything's going to end up in court, and any parties that have any misgivings are going to be able to object without even having to spend any money out of pocket. The difference between having a will and having what's called a revocable living trust is that a trust doesn't have to go through the court system at all. You can name somebody to step into your shoes and act as a trustee to be able to manage your assets if anything were to happen to you and you're unable to manage it yourself. So similar to powers of attorney, a trust is what we call a living instrument, and it starts protecting things immediately. Oftentimes, people hear about more complex plans, irrevocable trusts and tax planning and all these different things. Estate planning doesn't have to get complicated like that. It can, but it doesn't have to. In most scenarios, your revocable living trust is going to allow you to be in charge of managing your own trust as long as you're able to. If you're married, it's probably you and your spouse. And then you're going to have an instrument that will protect you from the court system if anything should happen. We've seen time and time again situations where a loved one passes away, and because they didn't have a proper estate plan, everything ends up in court, in probate, with a lot of stress and conflict for the family. So planning these things out ahead of time really avoids those problems. Now, what's specific about the farming community? One of the things that's very specific is a lot of times the intention is not to sell the family farm. And if you don't want something to happen, that's something you very clearly need to delineate in your documents. So we can actually set up a trust which will empower the family to continue to manage the assets without having to liquidate them. We could also specify, and if you have a business for your farm or for your ranch, you need to specify who is going to be the successor for that business. And a lot of times people think, well, if I leave the farm to so-and-so, then everybody else is going to be left out because that's the main asset in the family. Well, there are ways around that. We can leave other value as part of the estate, or we can specify payments to the other individuals within the family. But if they're not actively participating in the farming operations, then they probably shouldn't have a piece of the farm. It just positions everybody to have, conflicts, to be in a situation where they have a say, but they're not really vested in it, and then it creates problems down the road. So these are things that you really want to sit down with competent counsel, somebody who can walk you through how to make decisions and to be able to help you to be empowered with those decisions, to leave a proper plan so that you have proper succession of your assets and that you don't have problems down the road. Hopefully this was helpful, and if you have any questions, we'd be happy to sit down with you and do a free consultation.